Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this conversation with Greg and Mary Daphne. Great to see you all here today. So our topic for today is about the listening bias.
Listening bias. Do tell.
Yeah. So what's really interesting, well, first of all, you know that communication is a two-way street. So it's not only important to effectively convey your ideas and the delivery of your message being strong and smooth, but it also has to do with making good conversation, which entails good listening. And so part of what listening is about is not having any bias. And so I thought it'd be a good idea for us to delve into the listening bias. So what is the listening bias? That's a great question. It's basically, you can think of it as selective hearing. So basically just hearing what we want to hear.
What's that you said? I'm the best person you've ever known?
Yeah, exactly.
That would be listening bias.
Yeah, right. So you basically kind of like draw from unconscious bias, believe it or not, but also conscious bias. So consciously, changing the message or interpreting something that wasn't really there to interpret in the first place, or reading between the lines when, it wasn't that meaning at all, and hearing only what we want to hear.
Yeah, it's funny. I think we're all guilty of this from time to time. And for me, I feel like I'm more susceptible to listener bias when it's a topic that I'm passionate about, or that I'm very opinionated about, right? Something that maybe I've done a lot of research into, I feel like an expert on. I'm much more likely to have a bias and a specific point of view, right? Mm-hmm. And when I listen to someone else talk about it, I'm much more likely to only hear the things that reinforce what my view on that topic, and kind of tune out and ignore the aspects that maybe conflict with my bias.
Right, and that's an excellent point, like taking that expert view, that expert stance, which, if you're passionate about something and you've spent a long, time researching a certain area, and you have this like very informed decision-making ability, then that it's hard to not have this type of bias, right? But it's important to be cognizant of that. And I think the second way that this kind of comes into light is when you might have, formed an opinion about someone, and you peg them as, an X type of person, and they, speaking about different topics just seem to justify your opinion of them as they being an X type of person. I'm saying X so you fill in the blank with whatever adjective you feel like putting in there. But I think that's the other way that a kind of selective hearing process comes in. So we hear things that confirm our biases about a person or what they do or how they act or whatever it is that we're sort of passing judgment on, right?
Yeah, I think of actors often complain about getting typecast.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So let's take Keanu Reeves, right? Yeah. Not exactly the most expressive person. Fits very nicely into an action film.
Yeah.
We wouldn't necessarily think of him as appropriate for a comedy, right?
Or like a romantic movie.
Exactly. And so, it's these preconceived notions that we've typecasted about a person or about a topic that sort of calcify our ability to have a complete understanding or to be able to fully sort of understand and what's the word? To comprehend.
Yeah, I was about to say
right?
comprehend.
Yeah, comprehend the topic or the person in question.
Yeah, and to get to know them better or get to know what they're speaking about better, maybe even though you might have like an expert stance in a certain thing, they might come up with something that you hadn't even thought about and maybe hadn't looked at the research or read the literature about, and raise a really great point and help fill in sort of the blanks to something missing in your thinking about a certain topic, right? And we're being vague here because this really, it's just so context dependent, right? But just to show you that it doesn't just have to do with, ideas and things, but it also has to do with our judgment, our opinions about people as well.
Yeah, and often we're wrong. So
Yes.
the Keanu Reeves example, he actually
Yes.
did do a great comedy early on in his career,
Yeah.
Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Okay, yeah.
And it's a classic,
Right.
But because we all now think of him as an action actor, we would never imagine that he could do something like that. But he's capable of it, just as a lot of us are capable of things we don't really think that we're capable of, or other people.
Right. So, it's up to us to not pigeonhole people and calcify our thinking and our thoughts around them and what they do. And so how do we overcome the listening bias? What are some ways to stop it in its tracks before it runs a course very different from what it should be?
Yeah. How do we?
Well, one thing is to not be quick to pass judgment. And I mean, I'm going to go out and be so bold as to say, try to refrain from passing judgment to begin with. And if you seem to be or feel to be a more like judgmental or opinionated person, then maybe it's time to sort of like hold the reins on that and, tone it down a bit. And, everyone's judgmental to a certain degree. It's just part of our human nature. You could call it a flaw if you'd like. But it does help us understand the world and categorize. That's not to say that it's not detrimental and can, have deleterious effects on our social interaction. So that's why we have to rein it in and really not judging at all, if you can. Or just reining it in, like holding back.
Yeah, I mean, judging was very useful back when we needed to assess threats very quickly, right?
Yeah.
When everything was life and death.
Right.
These days, that's not really the case in most of our day-to-day interactions.
Yes.
Hopefully. And so this quick judgment, this jumping to an
Conclusions.
assessment, a conclusion of who someone is or how something works can actually really hold us back from understanding what the other person's perspective is.
Yes.
And it prevents us from having a more holistic understanding of the world. And so it's very hard to do,
Yeah.
but you can catch yourself doing it, right?
Totally.
When someone says something and you immediately feel some emotion,
Yeah.
that's a good indication that you're judging,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Whether it's anger or disgust, right?
Yeah.
Often these are negative emotions that get elicited by judgment.
Or superiority.
Superiority,
like, what do
exactly.
they think that,
Yeah. When you
Yikes.
feel that emotion, that's a good indication that you're starting to judge.
Yeah.
And you can use that sensation as a trigger to say, wait, I think I'm judging. Let me try and dial that back.
Yeah.
And just listen a little more, right?
Yeah.
And if I disagree or want clarification, then ask for it in a polite way. Try and get a little more information, but try and combat that judgment with a sense of curiosity.
Yeah, I love that. I love it. It's so important. And so Greg brought up a good point about listening, right? So actively listening and not listening to formulate an answer, but listening to probe, to ask questions, to cultivate that curiosity, to, spark further discussion, to really have an exchange of ideas and a knowledge transfer, right? As opposed to judging and only listening and hearing what we want to hear to confirm a bias that we already have, right? That doesn't get us anywhere. It doesn't give us opportunities to grow or to learn. So it's very counterproductive to effective communication, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing is to really push yourself to be more open to new ideas and, this is a big one, to differing viewpoints.
Yeah.
And to perspectives that might, go head to head with your own. Do you have anything to say about that?
I mean, I think some of the most successful people in the world are those who actively seek out differing viewpoints, right?
Yeah.
Because they want people to question the perspective, because that helps them have a more nuanced understanding. If you think about the classic trope of the king, emperor, empress,
Right.
Who's constantly surrounded by advisors,
Right.
sycophants who just, say yes to everything and say that every day is the best idea, right? There's no way to understand, or there's no way to improve really when you're in that environment.
Yeah.
If you can instead put yourself in an environment where there is a lot of sort of conflicting viewpoints, it forces you to look into the matter more closely, right? To have a deeper, more fundamental first principles understanding. And so it's that deferring viewpoint that actually turns you into more of an expert on whatever topic or whatever it is that's being discussed.
Absolutely. And it enriches your experience. It enriches your worldview, expands your horizons, right? So I think one of the best things in this regard is to surround yourself with people who don't have the same opinions as you do on certain things and really, transcend the effects of the echo chamber, right? Where everyone is just saying the same thing as you, has the same ideas as you, whether that's fabricated and maybe due to something like groupthink or conformity and group cohesion, or if it's just, they feel like it's easier to just agree with you, right? And to Greg's point, that's not really the best way to understand yourself and to evolve and to understand, the world really.
Yeah, and that's a key part about it. I think you nailed it on the head when you said easier, right? It is easier to surround yourself with people who agree with you. It's easier to not disagree with what other people are saying. But it's kind of boring, right?
So boring.
You kind of live in Pleasantville.
Yeah.
It's just ultimately, it's a very limiting way to go about your life.
Yeah.
Whereas when you challenge yourself and seek out opposition, I don't know, it adds some spice and,
Absolutely.
and novelty to life.
Yeah, and it gets you thinking, right? I always feel like it's a great brain exercise to get into like a discussion, a back and forth, a little bit of a debate, right? Of course, keeping emotions in check and not, because that's not, great for our health anyway. But for brain health, like coming up with like a stimulating conversation where it's not about agreeing, it's about covering all the bases and thinking of, thinking outside the box.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So those are some ways to counteract the listening bias. And instead of selectively hearing what you want to hear, you really listen attentively with an open mind and hear what's actually being said with all the nuances.
Yeah, it's kind of like if you lived, it's transitioning from a black and white world to a technicolor world, right? The black and white world is everything is aligned with your viewpoint or against your viewpoint, right? When you move into a technicolor world, there's a full spectrum of color, and you start to see that things aren't black and white. That there is a gradient to how much something agrees or disagrees with your perspective, and as a result, you find that your perspective starts to move across that gradient. Instead of being so polarized, it starts to become more nuanced and contextual,
Right.
which it's a much. I mean, what do you prefer to watch? Do you prefer to watch black and white programming, or do you prefer to watch color programming? Most of the time, it's better to watch something in color, and that's the way I like to go about my life.
Yeah.
I try to make it as vibrant as possible, and by embracing deferring viewpoints, seeking out
dissenting opinions.
For me, introduces that richness and vibrance that I might not get when I'm, constrained by my biases.
Right. So challenge yourself, seek out those dissenting opinions, and listen attentively so that you can ask questions, right? Foster that curiosity that Greg talked about. So yeah, it's very exciting. It brings a new dimension to conversation and just, ramps up your communication skills, and people will notice. They'll be impressed, and you'll also realize how much more enriching conversations and relationships, become by making this change.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you right here for another conversation.